Okay, so 3, 2. You can welcome everybody, you know.
Okay.
Coming along.
Okay.
Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Joanne Conway, and I'll be chairing the seminar this evening. We're just going to wait a few minutes until everyone has the chance to log in, and then we can begin the proceedings. So, Linda, do you know how many we have left, or I can see we've 30? Okay, so I can see people are signing in. Yes, yes. So I believe we have over 70 participants this evening for the seminar, which is fantastic, and people from all over Europe and beyond. So everyone is very, very welcome this evening. And good evening, Milena.
Mm-hmm.
And Marina, hello. So we're nearly there, I think, in terms of numbers. So we've 63 people so far. For a Friday night, that's good, I think.
Do you want to say about the chat and the Q&A maybe?
Yes, well, I was going to wait until everyone had logged in, but I can remind people at the end. So, hello, Israel. Hello, Tammy. Yes.
Wonderful.
You're very welcome. Yes, just in relation to the seminar this evening, just in response to Gustavo's paper and the format, what we'll ask you to do is, if you have comments, to use the chat amongst yourselves, which is fine. But if you have specific questions that you want to pose and ask Gustavo, we would ask you that you would use the Q&A. So that way that we can keep track of the questions and make sure that they're not lost in the thread. So just to remind you, so to use the Q&A if you have very specific particular question that you want to pose to Gustavo this evening, so that we can keep a track of those. Okay, thank you. So we're at 66. So perhaps we could make a start, do you think?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So once again, I'll say good evening to everybody, and you're very welcome to this evening's seminar. My name is Joanne Conway, and I am the current chair of ICLO-NLS here in Ireland. The title of this Friday event is Space Formation of the Analyst and its School, which forms a crucial part of ICLO's activities for the past 5 years. This space is one in which visiting analysts transmit their singular experience of the crucial problems of psychoanalysis, namely the knotting of the political dimension of psychoanalysis, the ends of analysis and the grouping of analysts, with its clinical and theoretical dimension through the experience of the school. This space, over the years, has and continues to allow for an interrogation of crucial questions pertaining to the formation of the analyst, the passage from analysand to analyst, and the bond of the analyst to the school as subject, all of which is underpinned by the singular desire of the analyst. And the latter two, that is the desire of the analyst, is a crucial question for all of us. How the desire for formation can pass to that of the desire of the analyst. And perhaps this is a question that we may encounter in the context of this evening's seminar. So before I introduce our guest this evening, I just want to make a short comment on the theme of this seminar, which is that of supervision. Supervision will be something that many engaged in a clinical work or training will be familiar with. But of course, there is something very singular in the Lacanian orientation and its theoretical and clinical conception of supervision. Lacan, in the Founding Act of June 1964, sets out his principles for the school, and in the section that he terms as pure psychoanalysis, he establishes the frame in which the training or formation of the analyst should occur. Here, he specifically names supervision and links it explicitly with the adoption of analytic responsibility. However, unlike many other modalities and orientations, the Lacanian orientation, and indeed the school, does not have established rules and regulations, minimum standards and requirements. One could say we don't have a level of mastery or knowledge that has to be attained pertaining to supervision. And so, excuse me, the school does not enforce any application of such measures. So what can that mean when for the Lacanian orientation, supervision, along with analysis, is a fundamental pillar for the formation of the analyst? I'm reminded of something that Lacan said in Seminar 7, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, that psychoanalysis does not have ethical guidelines or policies, but rather it is an ethic. In this context, therefore, one can link supervision and an engagement therein as inextricably linked to the ethical position of the analyst in supervision, in whatever capacity that is. Supervision is therefore on an equal footing, one can say, with an analysis itself, yet it is something that remains somewhat out of the limelight, forgotten when it comes to seminars and study days. Why is that? The title of this evening's seminar may give us a compass here. Why, when, and what? Supervision and the practitioner's resistance. Why does one seek supervision? What demand is at stake here, and why at this particular moment? Just like the demand for analysis, so too must the demand for supervision be read by the one to whom it is addressed and by the one who addresses it. And what? What is supervision? If, as Jacqueline Miller says, that in order for it to have any value, it must go beyond the regulation of the relation of the analyst to their patient and must encompass their relation to psychoanalysis as well. Does this perhaps give us a glimpse into what might be at stake in this notion of the practitioner's resistance? In other words, does one consent to undergo supervision? We will have the opportunity to follow these ideas this evening with our guest and guest speaker and friend of ICLO, Gustavo Dessal. I'm delighted and very happy to introduce Gustavo this evening. Particularly, as we had talked about earlier, this event was originally planned to take place on call in Dublin, and Gustavo has kindly agreed to meet with us all in this virtual space this evening. Gustavo is an analyst in Madrid. He is an analyst member of the School of Psychoanalysis and World Association of Psychoanalysis. He teaches at the Institute of the Freudian Field. He is also an author and has just published, excuse me, in 2019, Unconscious 3.0, What We Do with Technologies and What Do Technologies Do with Us. I hope I've translated that okay in terms of the title, yeah. Gustavo. Yeah, okay. So now we will hear from our esteemed guest and colleague, and afterwards we will have some commented questions and discussion with 3 ICLO members, and of course then with all of you. If you have questions, and just reiterate, please put them in the Q&A section so that we can be sure to pick them up. So Gustavo, we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joanne. Well, so good evening, everyone. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the ICLO Bureau and friends and colleagues, to Linda Clark, to Joanne Conway and Susan McFeely, who had worked so kindly to organize this meeting in which I was supposed to be there live. But anyway, well, we have to thank the possibility of doing it anyway by this means. This will be a subject for tomorrow, because we have to, well, to be happy for the possibility of being anyway, and albeit this way, to be together this evening. So thank you so much to all of you, because you have been really very, very kind with me, with the organization and making things so easy and so pleasant. There are several, I must clarify something. I made the translation myself, so I will ask you, I mean all of you, a little bit of indulgence, because my written English is not very good, but I think it will be understandable for all of you. There are several conditions which are required to occupy the place of the analyst. They are the consequence of the experience followed by the practitioner in his or her own analysis. That experience has allegedly produced a loss, the renouncement to all fantasy of mastering the knowledge. This acceptance of the other's castration will always imply a narcissist injury. Lacan expresses it in a very clear way when in his lesson of the 17th of December 1969, The Other Side of Psychoanalysis, he says the analyst has to abandon, I quote him, the idea that knowledge can, in any way or at any time, even as a hope for the future, form a closed whole. So there is no hope left in this sense. And we know that hope is intimately linked to the feeling of time. We have a very, let's say, emotional example. I think it was made up by Italians in the context of the pandemic. Everything will be all right. This became a hashtag everywhere. Everything will be all right. Well, it's the hope. People need hopes, of course. Unfortunately, we psychoanalysts, we have come to this world to pierce partially some of these kind of hopes, but at the same time, we admit that they are very necessary. So one of the problems related to supervision is the possibility that the analyst, as supervisor, could unconsciously intend to restore that loss, to alleviate the narcissist injury by playing the role of the master of knowledge, of a meta-knowledge. So the position of the supervisor poses the risk of becoming the other of the other. This can also be reinforced by the fact that the practitioner puts the supervisor in the place of the subject supposed to know. That is to say, there is a tendency to create a transfer that is not easily distinguished from the one which is developed in an analysis. As a proof of this, it's not unusual that the practitioner turn a control into an analytical session, which means to move from the unconscious of the patient to his or her own unconscious. A clarification, I won't get into the distinction between control and supervision. I suppose we all know the Lacan's pun about the super audition. There is nothing super, of course, in supervision or in control. So I will use both terms in the same sense. So the question is much more complex since there is no clear and definite line dividing the practitioners and the case he or she brings to control. Our starting point is quite elementary. What do we control? Or even more simple yet, why do we supervise? There is not a single answer to this question. But I think that one of the frequent reasons we ask for a supervision is when we, as practitioners, experience some sort of inconvenience with a case. This inconvenience is related to something that overwhelms the practitioner, something that moves his or her position as a listener. Hence, the importance of situating that point in the supervision. In other ways, in the same way, it's basic to search what has triggered a demand of analysis when we undertake a series of preliminary interviews. It's indispensable to discover what has pushed a demand of control. So not only what do you want to control, but also what makes you feel the need to control. Supervision is not an encounter between a teacher and his disciple. It aims at removing an obstacle, the analyst's resistance. In that sense, the supervision might teach something, but that is different from thinking that the supervisor is the one who teaches. There is no doubt that the supervisor can add something. For example, something related to the diagnosis or the direction of the treatment, but the main function is to allow the practitioner to reestablish his position and regard his own act, since ultimately the demand of supervision is unleashed by the feeling of being overpassed by this act. I would like to dwell a little bit on the importance of feeling overwhelmed by the analytic act. To do this, I will use a remark of Lacan in his lesson of the 14th of November 1962, at the beginning of his seminar 10, The Anxiety, when he says, and I quote, "But for the analyst starting out in his practice, it's not ruled out, thank goodness, much as we might show great aptitude for being an analyst, that he may feel some anxiety from his first dealings with the patient on the couch. Let's pay attention to this, thank goodness, because it's a crucial, in my interpretation, is a crucial remark. Following Jacques Miller, quoting Nabokov, I think the essential, as you know, is in the divine detail. Why does Lacan consider anxiety as something that might be a positive sign of the position of the analyst? I will give you my reading. Because the anxiety is very close to the not knowing, is the affection of the not knowing. So the position of the analyst entails being in the conditions of supporting a certain relation, supporting and bearing a certain relation with the not knowing. In a similar way, the practitioners shouldn't be settled in the comfort of the automaton. The analyst who is stuck in his place, the analyst who is not a little bit decentered, might favor an inertial statics in the treatment of the analysis. That's the point where the demand of supervision comes from. Its origin is the healthy inconvenience that prevents the practice from becoming dizzy, and I would say as well, boring. You know that there aren't many references by Lacan to the subject of supervision. At least not a number enough to deduce a Lacanian doctrine on supervision. Perhaps he wasn't interested in promoting such a doctrine. In his lesson of the 18th of November, 1975, in the seminar The Symptom, we find a curious remark he makes about those people who control within. On the one hand, Lacan says that the analysts behave like rhinos. Is it well pronounced? Rhinos. Yeah.
It's rhino.
Yeah?
Sorry, rhino, like rhinoceros.
Rhino. Okay, rhino,
Yes.
rhinoceros. Okay, rhinos. We know that rhinos are clumsy and short-sighted animals. On the other hand, he says that his approach to the supervision has two stages. There is an initial stage in which he shows his agreement to everything the analyst does. He doesn't question them anything at all. That is not a paternalist attitude in the sense of learn by yourself from your own mistakes. I think that there is nothing of this nature. The purpose of this first stage is not to feed in the supervisand the idea that what it is at stake in the control is an achievement of knowledge. Later on, there will come a second stage that Lacan describes this way. I quote, "The second stage consists in playing with that misunderstanding that could release the symptom." Indeed, the interpretation works mainly by means of the equivocity. And Lacan adds, there has to be something in the signifier that resounds. This is totally, at least for me, totally enigmatic. And what is that interpretation Lacan speaks about in this context? This second stage that takes place with those practitioners who control with him. Does he mean that the interpretation that the supervisor makes about the case, the interpretation that would be able to move the jouissance attached to the analysant's symptom? We would probably answer positively. But it might also happen that the interpretation produces a resonance in the analyst. When these interpretations hit the goal, it allows the analyst to find the coordinates that takes or bring him back to the right position in the transference, the semblance of the object cause of desire. In that sense, the supervision operates more as a rectification of the position in the transference than a transmission of knowledge. It's very important to underline that the supervision doesn't provide a stockpile of clinical knowledge. What is at stake in the desire of the analyst, his knowing how to do. No, sorry. What is at stake? It's a question. What is at stake is the desire of the analyst, his knowing how to do. This knowing is neither an information nor a stored theoretical knowledge, because both the analytic session and the supervision follow an always singular event that counts as one. So we have a classical idea about supervision. I will show you. This is not a big deal, of course, but you can see the classical idea of supervision, S1 addressing S2, where S1 is the demand of the supervisand that will find an answer, S2, in terms of knowledge from the supervisor. This is the legend of what a supervision means. Conversely, according to the supervision orientated by Lacan's teaching, we have to think in these terms. What does it mean? It means that the problem as regards the supervision is how to prevent the demand from being satisfied by an answer that encourages the fantasy of the knowledge of the analyst as a knowledge that can progress. Of course, to interfere the vector which goes from S1 to S2 does not imply that the difficulty that the analyst has brought will remain the same, of course. We need to find a way to undo the knot, but this won't be achieved unless we bear in mind that the knot is not tied up by a deficiency of knowledge. Being part of the formation, the supervision might have analytic effects on the practitioner and stimulate a step forward in his or her own analysis. In my personal experience as supervisand, not supervisors, but as a supervisand, I would say that the best controls I ever had were those that made me discover something new in my analytical process. And when I place myself in the position of the supervisor, I always keep a basic principle. Nobody knows the analyst more and better than his or her own analyst. That's the reason why I'm usually prone to trusting what the analysts that control with me do with their patients. I trust that they have made or are making a psychoanalytical path and that they will basically hold to it. So my role is limited. I just try to wake them up when they fall under the hypnosis of understanding, because understanding is a very, very sliding slope. I would like to highlight another aspect about supervision. Controlling can be as well very useful for the practitioner to work out his or her feeling of guilt. This feeling that we know is linked to the superego, interferes the treatment at least in two main ways. On the one hand, when the analyst takes on his shoulders the burden of the patient's complaint about an alleged lack of therapeutic benefits. Many practitioners tend to identify themselves with that kind of demand. In such cases, the supervision is quite important not to get entangled in the transference aggressiveness. And on the other hand, and this is something we see especially in those analysts who start their practice, the feeling of guilt reveals in the difficult to maintain a silent position. They unconsciously believe that their function has to be justified. Therefore, we found the superego commandment to interpret. The analyst who feels compelled to interpret because the patient can't leave empty-handed, or let's rather say empty-eared. The supervision can be the proper space to deal with that sense of guilt, or at least to bring it to light and forward it to the analysis of the analyst. Let me tell you an example, as we say in Spanish, of my own crop, of my own harvest. I don't know what's the equivalent in English, but I think you will understand what I mean. An example that left a fundamental mark in my analytic formation. The first time I asked for a control. It was an unforgettable experience that was doubled a few years afterwards when I read the famous warning that Lacan pronounced in his seminar on psychosis: stay away from understanding. The case I wanted to control was about a young woman. She had told me a dream in which her mother was standing on top of the house roof. The patient is close to the house, looking at her mother. Suddenly, the mother stumbles and falls. Her body remains still on the ground. The daughter wakes up, seized by an extreme anxiety at the sight of the fallen body. I told this dream to the supervisor and my interpretation: a death desire from the daughter to her mother. The supervisor frowned and asked me what I was basing my interpretation on. Well, I said, The mother falls off the roof and dies. The supervisor almost interrupted me. Your patient didn't say that. She was shocked by her mother's fail. Sorry, by her mother's fall. And failed, probably. Actually, the mother falling from the place where she had been for my patient doesn't mean she was dead. She's only fallen. The master signifier of the dream, the one that the anxiety points at, is the fall, making resound the equivocity of the signifier fall. The supervisor not only put me back on the right track, but allowed me to internalize Lacan's advice: do not understand. Understanding is one of the most recurrent manifestations of the fantasy of playing the master of knowledge. Let's remark as well that the main function of a control is not to solve an urgency, though of course it can be very useful in that sense, but to open a space where to think and figure out the consequences of the analytic act. Asking for help to avoid the loss of a patient produces a distortion of what is supposed to happen in a supervision, because the demand of a magic knowledge is somehow expected. A knowledge that claims for a sort of omnipotence, as if the rescue interpretation could be found. Of course, I don't mean that these kinds of troubles cannot be brought to the supervision. I'm just trying to say that they are not by default the basis of it. In the act of foundation of his school, Lacan says that the analysis of the analyst has effects on the whole practice of the subject involved. Thus, the control is imposed at the very moment when these effects appear in the practice, to protect the patient from them. How should we read this? This is a very interesting side of the issue. Lacan's approach to the supervision, as Johan has evoked, is essentially ethical, aiming not only at the practitioner, but basically at the patient. What is at stake in the need to preserve the analysand, to keep or her aside and protected from the effects of the analysis of the analyst. The control was and has undoubtedly an epistemic value. This value is not correlated to a teaching in a sense of a transfer of knowledge from the supervisor to the supervisant. The gain of knowledge that is achieved in a supervision comes from the fact that speaking about a case and the impasse that has triggered the demand of control has in itself an effect of interpretation. The mere account is already an elaboration of knowledge. There is also a strictly clinical dimension. The diagnosis might seem essential, but it's not that much. Of course, the diagnosis has its own importance. We should rather know what kind of stuff we are dealing with. But the ethical dimension is pretty much more decisive. The control is a practice that is supported by the ethics of psychoanalysis. Our goal is to preserve the desire of the analyst, the desire implied in his act, which is not a subjective desire. To preserve the desire of the analyst, I said, from the incidence of the ordinary discourse. The discourse, the practitioners, is unavoidable included, even if his or her own analysis has to reduce that incidence as much as possible. How can we reconcile the supervision with the principle that the analyst only authorization comes from himself? Because there is a stage in which the demand of control is deep down a demand of authorization. I want to know if what I'm doing is right or wrong. That's what Lacan tried to avoid when he agreed with the rightness. It's just in the second time when the supervisant achieves the dismissal of the subject supposed to know of the supervisor, then that supervision becomes the place to test the effects of subjectivization of the desire of the analyst. Well, that's it. Now I would like to listen to your questions or your comments.
I'm back. I was just trying to unmute myself. Gustavo, that was really wonderful and really provoking. I know we spoke a little bit before, and what struck me very much about the theme is how crucial supervision is in formation, and yet how little it's spoken of. And that's something that seems quite paradoxical to me, that we are so much caught up in the idea of what is a psychoanalysis, what is the end of analysis, the past, etc. And yet from what you presented this evening, it's very clear that without supervision, one cannot, I think, take up ethically or otherwise the position of analyst or know something about the desire of the analyst. So it was very striking to me, and I have a question that maybe we can look at later because we're joined by our colleagues, but one was to do with the place of knowledge and the fall of the subject supposed to know that occurs in analysis, but also from what you're speaking about in supervision. That I found a quote that's a play on Lacan's later teaching about the names of the Father, and it says, "One can only do without supervision on condition that one learns how to make use of it." And I thought that was a really interesting remark to do with something of the dismantling of knowledge and the fantasy of acquiring this, as you say, stockpile of clinical and theoretical knowledge that one can whip out. So maybe we'll get a chance to ask or speak about that. I'd like to introduce onto the screen our colleagues, Susan McFeely, who is the Secretary of ICLO Bureau, Linda Clark, who is the Treasurer of the Bureau of ICLO, Marlene French-Mullen, who is an ICLO member and clinical practitioner, Sheila Power, an ICLO member and clinical practitioner, and Caroline Hinu, also ICLO member and clinical practitioner. And we have in this part had some reading around the theme, and each has a comment or a question that they would like to address with you, Gustavo. So Sheila, if you'd like to
Thank you.
ask your question. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Gustavo, I have a question for you. Maybe you've covered some of it, but it's from a reading of Eric Laurent's On the Right Side of Supervision, and it's a quote he makes of Lacan in it. And in this paper, he said that Lacan in 1975 considered supervision to be a super audition. He says, in listening to what a practitioner has told you, through what he tells you, one can have a representation of the one who is in analysis. And my question, I think, pertains to this. In supervision, in the presentation of a case, one's formation can be read. So it is not such a presentation of a case, but as a presentation of a subject, one whose act overtook him, to quote Lacan's words. And really my question then is, in what way can the supervisee best use supervision to support his or her own formation in relation to grasping the dimension of desire at play and not chasing the knowledge, or the know-how of knowledge, sorry. That's it.
Okay. Do I answer now? Do we gather? Yes?
Yeah,
Okay.
if you want, we can do one by one, and then we can look at the Q&A also section to follow people's questions.
Sheila, yes, it's a very funny way to speak about supervision. This pun of super audition, because what is really surprising is the fact that doing this kind of practice that has nothing to do with the scientific possibility of objectivizing a case, we have the chance to, and this has in a certain way, this has a similar structure to the past. Because the one who demands a pass, he will tell the passers is the
Passers.
And the passers will, on their turn, retell the story to the jury. And the jury will make, it's a kind of super audition too, because the jury has to extract something that has to be listened by the passer, and there's no way to objectivize it. I mean, there's no records. The same happens in the supervision. Of course, the supervisor, how can he or she know that what is being brought to him is exactly the correspondence between the story, is a version of the supervisant, is the subject that is brought to supervision, it's a fiction in the main sense. Fiction is for us, of course, nothing to do with the idea of something imaginary. So that's why, of course, there are many different styles of bringing a case to supervision. There are people who take notes. There are people that try to reproduce the patient's text the most closer to the words of the patient. And there are some other people that they prefer to, well, play a sort of free association, not preparing the case beforehand too much. So there are different styles, but any of them, of course, will always fail what the patient has said, because it's a version. But that version, why is that version so interesting for us? And how can that version produce an effect not only on the analyst, but also on the patient? As we say in I don't know how to say this in English. Florencia, can you hear me?
Yes.
Tiro por elevación, ¿cómo se dice?
I don't even know what that means in Spanish.
When you kick a ball and you surpass the other and you hit
The goal.
The goal. You are able to put the ball into the goal by surpassing all the other players. So how can the supervisor say something that can be not only important for the analyst, but it will produce a change in the treatment itself, in the treatment that is an experience, an encounter between the analyst that the supervisor knows and some other that is absolutely an unknown for us, that is brought to us just through the words of the supervisant. So the answer for that is that exactly what we introduce is something, if we have the chance, if there is some good luck in the supervision, not always it happens, when we are able as supervisor to touch something delicate in the position of the analyst, something that is able to put him or her back on the track of the position of the analyst, the desire of the analyst, this will produce, that's the reason why it produces an effect on the treatment itself. So the interpretation, the word, the intervention of the supervisor will reach, strangely, indirectly, will reach the patient through the path of the desire of the analyst. And concerning Joanne's question, I think that, supervision is, I think, guided by the same principles of psychoanalysis as a whole. As you said, I agree absolutely with you that supervision and psychoanalysis, the analytical practice as a whole, is before everything is an ethics. So all what comes afterwards depends on the ethics of psychoanalysis. Even the interpretation we make of what we mean by the unconscious is also ethical. So I said that the principles of psychoanalysis as a practice rule also the guidelines of supervision. In what sense? The supervisor, of course, he or she has a knowledge. We can't trash that knowledge.
Of course.
Of course, it's true. It's something we have. Because we have an experience, because we have an amount of reference knowledge we have collected all over the years. We have read a lot, read the seminars, read Freud's work, Freud's disciples' works, so on and so forth. That is absolutely indispensable. And this is, of course, absolutely valid. We have three legs: study, analysis, and supervision. Those are the three legs of psychoanalysis. But at the same time, and we have a theory that has a general value. When we speak about, for example, hysteria or psychosis, or despite the several changes that we will find in Lacan or Freud's work, we know that we have a general theoretical framework that is valid for everyone. I mean, for every psychosis, for every hysteria. And at the same time, we always keep in mind, we bear in mind the motto of Motus Freud. No, you have to listen your patient as if it were the first time you meet someone in psychoanalysis. You have to forget at the same time, you have to set apart all you have in your mind, all the knowledge, your experience. And that is also, in my opinion, this is also valid for the supervision as supervisors. Of course, you have an experience. Of course, many people will very quickly, something will ring a bell to you if you are the supervisor. Something about the behavior of the patient, the master signifiers of the patient, of course. But at the same time, we have to make an effort that is also an outcome of our personal analysis. Because as supervisors, of course, not only the supervisants get a stimulus to go back to their analysis and figure out what had happened in the supervision. We as supervisors many times have the same chance to discover in ourselves, in our hearing, something that we can bring to our own analysis. Sheila, did I at least understand anything?
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Marlene, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, even though it's more or less obsolete because Gustavo has already answered it.
Never obsolete.
But the question that I had written comes from a place of frustration from the early times of my training in the early days. And I managed to put some words on it. And I would like to say them anyway, even though Gustavo has answered most of it. So, and what I would like to say is that my question circles around the double axis of the production of anxiety in analysis and by extension in supervision. And the Lacan's enduring question of how can psychoanalysis teach what cannot be taught? Because to me, of knowledge in supervision in my demand anyway, if nothing else. So at the beginning of seminar 10, Lacan says that we have to sense what the subject can bear about anxiety. He says that the analyst produces anxiety, but to do it in such a way that it regulates anxiety. He also asks, who are we sparing? You must not think you're sparing the patient while you're really sparing yourself. So my question is, when you bring something as an analyst to your supervisor, often, not now, not now, but in the past, when you bring something to your supervisor, you are met with a silence, nothing, no production of anything. And to me, that felt, even though Lacan continues to say, you mustn't understand there is a divestition of knowledge, there is a divestition of mastery, you mustn't take up the position of the master in any shape or form. The production of anxiety is gigantic in a supervision moment at that time. And to me, I always ask myself, must it also not be the case that the supervisor must be able to impart some knowledge in relation to the direction of the treatment? Otherwise, the distinction between an analysis and a supervision becomes hopelessly entangled, but also his divestment of mastery and his silence must not cover an impotence, or worse, an unnecessary withholding in a perverse way. So I just wanted to say that because that is an experience that I've been carrying with me for a long time in relation to supervision, and I just wanted to, even though you have answered.
No, Marlene, I think that you have posed something very, very interesting. And I would like to say something about, firstly, about silence in general. Because unfortunately, sometimes we have the idea that silence is the basis of the analyst position. In a certain way, it is. But to be silent doesn't mean not to pronounce a single word. You can say many words and at the same time remain silent, because silence is not only, is also something that we have to figure out in a figuratively way. Of course, I reject the idea of the supervisor remaining silent as a stone, and no, this is, as you say, this arouses a gigantic amount of anxiety. And there's no need to mistreat the supervisor that way. I think that we have to be very, very respectful, not only with our patients and with our analysts, with people who come to see us asking for a supervision. So I said that at the beginning of my text, of my talk, that I trust the people who bring their cases to me. I trust them because I trust of course, I trust them if they have undertaken an important psychoanalytical experience or are in analysis. I trust them because nobody knows better and more and better the patient than the analyst himself. But you said something else that is very important. Of course, this is a personal position. Maybe this is very, this can be discussed. I think that there is, of course, I try to keep the framework of supervision and not to become an analyst. I don't like the idea of interpreting a supervisant as if I were an analyst. But sometimes it happens, and it's very usual, especially at the beginning of the practice of the analyst, that he or she will immediately discover that the issue that he brings to the supervision is linked to something of his own subjectivity. There's no need for me to say that. And I try to be very delicate in that sense, because sometimes, of course, I realize that the obstacle is not a question of in a lack of capacity, a lack of skill in the analyst. Usually it's not the case. The case is something that makes an obstacle in the position of the desire of the analyst. So if it's the occasion, if the occasion is favorable for me, I would just say something very delicate, just to indicate the supervisor that this is something that she'd rather take to the analysis. So, of course, we mustn't entangle supervision and try not to turn it into a session of psychoanalysis. But sometimes it happens. Sometimes it happens. It's a frequent, I don't know if very frequent, but it happens that, for example, someone who begins to supervise a case after some time becomes our patient. Something is very common, this experience. So it means that you can trace, you can draw a very sharp line that divides the two fields, the personal psychoanalysis and the supervision. I would like to, if we have time, I would like to give another personal experience, me asking for a control.
And just to, sorry, just to,
yes.
to clarify, Gustavo, also just in terms for people, if they're not familiar, that control is the word for supervision that's used mainly in France, etc. So just that's the word that we're...
I will give time for more questions, and if we have if we have a spare time, yes, I will give another example that is very funny.
Well, we have to hear it then. So I wanted to just go to the Q&A section as well. I think you've covered Marina's question around the position of the supervisor as the analyst of the supervisee. I think you've covered that. So there's a question here from Itzel about the concept of diagnosis. And could it be explained in more detail? And if making a diagnosis does not fall into the fantasy of knowledge again, closing or influencing how the analyst would listen after, during an analysis. So in other words, does the hypothetical diagnosis produced in supervision, what the effects of that are?
Yeah, well, this is a very broad subject. We will need a new seminar to cover at least the beginning of an answer. Diagnosis, I have a title for it. I propose a title for you. Diagnosis today. Or diagnosis today in psychoanalysis today. What's the role of diagnosis? Well, I will answer by a personal approach to this. We know that in the late teaching of Lacan, the question of diagnosis is a little bit blurred in the theory of the notes. Blurred in the sense, not that the importance of diagnosis has vanished in his work, but on the contrary, the problem of diagnosis is very much complexed by the theory of notes. So the structural way of making a diagnosis changes. But at the same time, we have to play with both theories. One, the structural theory that distinguishes neurosis, psychosis, and
Perversion.
And the topological theory that keeps, it's what Hegel called an Aufhebung. It keeps and overwhelms and overpasses the structural diagnosis. I think, in my opinion, that diagnosis is something important in a supervision, but not at the beginning, unless the diagnosis of the case is so important, and we notice, I'm speaking now as a supervisor, unless we notice that how you say, the person who asked for I say supervisant.
Is it supervisee?
Supervisee. Well, I invented the word.
Yeah, it's a great word. It's okay. We have a new word.
As like analysant, supervisant. Well, it's easier for me to pronounce that. So, as a supervisor, unless we notice from the very beginning that the diagnosis is very clear and the practitioner is absolutely lost in that sense, this could turn into a very, let's say, dangerous situation for the treatment. I prefer not to get, if it's not that case, I prefer to leave the question of diagnosis for later.
Okay.
And sometimes I admit that I have some people who bring once and again the same case, maybe along 1 year, and after 1 year, neither he or me nor me are really clear about the diagnosis. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we have found out what has to be respected in the treatment. So in relationship to diagnosis, this is what I could say in a fast way, of course.
Okay.
In a quick.
Yes. Okay. We have, thank you. And we have a question from Mari regarding compulsory supervision.
Can I say something?
Of course. Yes.
But because I think this is a question that can be a bit confusing. The supervision practice that Gustavo has been talking about is supervision as one of the pillars in the training, in the formation of analysts. That is a formation that has nothing to do with any form of training in universities, in professional organizations, in careers, courses, masters in various disciplines. So in a sense, there was another question that pointed to that in the question and answers. Of course, it's one of the elements that Lacan completely produced a subversion, and one of the things that distinguishes the practice of psychoanalysis in the school of Lacan from the practice of psychoanalysis in the IPA or in other organizations. Supervision is not compulsory, obligatory.
But it's very much recommendable. So much recommendable.
Precisely, Gustavo, because it's not compulsory, it's an ethical imperative.
Exactly, yes. That's the link between supervision and ethics, as Johan mentioned at the beginning.
And also, because the question of the guilt was taken up, I think that point of your talk was very important, Gustavo. The treatment of guilt and anxiety, which are forms of resistance. If we understand that resistance is everything that comes from the practitioner as a subject. If the practitioner operates as a subject, he cannot be in the position of the analyst. So the difficulty is to cut the session, to charge the money, to increase the price, to intervene in certain ways.
And to speak.
And
not to speak.
Mostly, as you said, to shut up. Mostly to shut up.
Exactly.
But also to speak when it's necessary. These are all phenomena that in a way
stem from the subject interfering the position of the analyst.
Exactly.
But I mean, it's very clear. We were speaking about it in his Krian, the presentation on transference, when he speaks about Freud and the transference with Dora, and you know this idea of counter-transference, which he doesn't go along with, but more that it's the analyst at that moment isn't in the position of analyst. He's the thing that stalls the treatment, effectively. Because you're there, as you say, as in another capacity. So I think actually Linda has a question, and we'll come and go back and forth between the two, if that's okay. And actually, sorry, I wanted to look at the question from Divienne, and I think it's also another seminar in the breadth, where she asked, could you say more about the analytic act? Because you were speaking about the demand for supervision as a moment perhaps where the supervisee is overwhelmed, or the analyst is overwhelmed by their act.
Yeah.
And I might come in after that, Joanne.
Yes, no problem.
Caroline, yeah, please.
So do you want to go ahead, Caroline, and then I know Linda
Yes.
has a question also, so we'll try and
really, thank you. Really, Gustavo, it's not a question, it's some remarks. And I was placing this, just following what Florencia has said and what you were saying earlier, between the anxiety, if you like, and the other side of the axiom as the act. And thinking of the act and reading about the rhino, I think it's a great picture of that, I suppose, that undivided subject who charges in with a certainty of his act is how I was thinking of it. And this idea of an act without measure. So it's not knowing what effect it will have. And that Lacan also speaks, I think, somewhere of the innocence. Again, referring back to that, not having this supposition of a knowledge upon which to base something. And within that, I was thinking of the desire of the analyst to be, and you know, as a transference to psychoanalysis, as to be able to remain in the analytic position. And I was thinking of, say, the how, if you like, the effects of the supervision, one could say that they may be verified, or the effect of which could be realized in an act, in a psychoanalytic act, and also in the desire of the analyst. And with that, I thought of a small paper I had read by somebody who was in supervision with Lacan. And it goes back to your point you made at the very beginning, that you didn't want to speak about the difference, if you like, between being in analysis, being in supervision, and it's not the same thing. But what struck me about this account was this person who went saying to Lacan that she was thinking of going to this, and he said no. And so then she said, how about this other one? And he said no. And then he said to her, come back after one of her sessions of analysis that day. And the supervision was conducted on the couch thereafter. And what struck me about that was this element of time, of going without indulging in the narrative, if you like, of the patient. And his intervention was that of a cut on the equivocation.
Very interesting. I know that story. Yeah, I know the book you are mentioning. Yes, I read it. It's a very interesting. I don't remember the name of the author. Do you?
I do, but you'll have to correct my pronunciation. Estela Solana Suarez.
Estela Solano. Yeah, Estela Solano Suarez. Yes, yes. She is a colleague from Argentina, living in Paris since many years. And she made a short experience with Lacan, but very important for her. And I know yes, she told me personally that story is very interesting. Well, of course, don't excite ourselves too much with those things that are very interesting to make us think and figure out what it means, and not imitate them, of course. Lacan was unique, absolutely unique. So we can reproduce, and we really don't have exactly what was in his mind doing that. But anyway, this is very interesting, and I think that is a proof for us, at least a very simple proof, that the distinction between analysis and supervision is not a real border. It's not a Möbius ribbon, but it's not a border that you can clearly cross. There are moments in which supervision is in this analytical session, and I will give you, if do we have time?
Yes, if you're happy.
Linda,
yes.
I have a question, and afterwards I will give you an example.
Okay.
I think will be clear in this sense.
Okay, so the question, did we cover in terms of the analytic act, the analyst in a moment being overwhelmed? I think Caroline picked up on that in what she's speaking about in terms of Estela's predicament when she is speaking to Lacan. That is that she returns to the couch. The other one.
Just on that, what struck me in that vignette was the desire of the analyst, not Lacan, but the person with whom was looking for supervision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there is, and I think this also touches on what we spoke about. There's a few kind of connecting axes here, which is, you know, I suppose in terms of the end of an analysis, there is the past to put that to the test, which you spoke about, and the testimony when Lacan, the kind of correspondence between the super audition and hearing about a treatment, blah, etc. But also then how does one test the effects of a supervision if there isn't an equivalence or a correspondence, if you like, to the past in that way, and there isn't the obligation, let's say, to have undergone, this is Malka's question, to have undergone supervision in order to apply for the pass or join the school, at least until recent years. It says, yet it is the school's responsibility to offer supervision. What is your opinion? And I mean, Lacan speaks about that in the Founding Act also of supervision for the training.
I think that as a school, we have supervision is not mandatory. It's not compulsory.
Compulsory, yes.
Compulsory, but of course we have to encourage all the time the supervision, the practice of supervision, and we notice that in the story, not the story, the history of the AMP, we notice that there are waves. From time to time, the subject of supervision arises like something absolutely new, and we find ourselves once and again speaking about the same thing that we spoke 10 years before. Why? Because this is something that there is a tendency of making supervision a practice that is gently and soundlessly sinking once again. So we have to resurface it from time to time. We could discuss the reason why. I think, of course, I have some hypotheses, but I will prefer to stay at the point that supervision is not mandatory, but it has to be encouraged by the ethical position of a school. And I think that we, as peers, we have to encourage ourselves about the importance, to remind ourselves the importance of supervision. How do we measure, how do we prove, how do we test the effect of the supervision? I'll dare say that the first effect is the satisfaction of the supervisor. The satisfaction that will appear afterwards when he or she comes back and says, something happened. I don't know how, but something different happened. And he brings not only what has changed in the treatment, but we notice that there is a satisfaction, a rectification of the satisfaction in the analyst. And I think this is very important. I will end up with a story that is really funny about another control, as me as a supervisor. I had a patient, a psychotic, who worked with me and is still working for many years. And he was a man that among his different psychotic symptoms, he experienced an extreme body event, a sort of elementary phenomenon, a blushing, but not a blushing that only affected his face, but his whole body. And this was something that he experienced in front of the other's gaze. Well, we began to work around this. He was an artist, and he had found a very interesting attempt to deal with this symptom, trying to divert or to dodge the other's gaze from his body to his work of art. Through his art, he was trying to concentrate the other gaze and take it off from his body. The demand of analysis was due to the fact that, well, this didn't work very much. So we worked for many years around this. And he was able to overcome this symptom. He was able to live a satisfactory life among people, he was able to to leave back his deep solitude in which he lived, and he became a happy person. But something and for me, something terribly disgraced happened. He stopped his artistic activity. He didn't complain about that. But I was absolutely, I must tell, I was very much worried about the effect of the analysis. The patient had turned into a very happy person. He was able to live a very satisfactory life, and he dropped his artistic activity. So I went to my supervisor, very much worried about what had happened. And I tried to explain and to summarize the case. And at the end, he asked me, why did you bring me this case? Because I'm really worried about the fact that this man has dropped his artistic activity. And he asked me, the supervisor asked me, and why are you so much concerned about this? And I realized that this very question had touched a core, something very inner in me. It was something of my subject interfering with the desire of the analyst. And it's another example of a control that put me on the track of the desire of the analyst, and it allowed me to make a very important step forward in my own and personal experience as an analyst. All right.
Thank you. Can we, just before we finish, Gustavo, Susan has a comment.
Yeah, of course.
We finish up and then.
Yeah, of course.
I think you've actually just covered it, actually, Gustavo, because I suppose what struck me about, obviously, your title, and as Lacan says, the resistance is the analyst's resistance, you know, and I think of the many forms that it presents itself, you know, in the question, oh, do I need supervision? Do I need to talk about this subject? You know, how it presents itself in so many ways. And I suppose it is only, I mean, even though there are three legs, as you say, of the formation of the analyst, the supervision, the analysis, and study, there are moments that the supervision, and this can also maybe be read as a form of resistance, that the supervision isn't always treated, as Joanne said, in this, you know, in the same way as the analysis is so important, you know. And I suppose it was just a very personal kind of thought I was thinking about, and you've kind of spoken a little bit about it now, was how recently I experienced a moment of overwhelmment with a case. And it was actually a question from my supervisor that asked me the particularity of that case. Why do you bring this case, you know? And it was at that moment, as you say, within the supervision, it was at that moment I realized it was something of my own subjectivity that was actually causing this overwhelmment, you know. And of course brought it to the analysis, and very clearly, as you say in your paper, the reorientation of one in the position of the analyst, and the reduction of that anxiety, overwhelmment. Now, the question I have actually, which is something I think it's close to Joanne's, I think you kind of said at the beginning, Joanne, is we have been speaking all evening about the analysis and supervision, but what struck me very much was when Veronique Farus came to speak to us a couple of years ago at her moment as teaching of AE. And she was speaking of the very particular use of supervision after the end of analysis. And I wonder, could you say something of that, Gustavo?
Well, I'm not a specialist of
no.
experience of the past. Well, because I haven't made the experience of the past myself. So I speak from the perspective of what people who have done the experience have taught me. I dare say that maybe there is a similarity between what happens in the transformation of the analyst practice after the past, and the transformation of the way you as an analyst bring a case to supervision, an analyst that has become an analyst
member
yeah.
at the school.
AS. I think that, for example, something that I think that from the experience of my colleagues, my peers, or people whose testimonies I read, I think that there is a different way of the way you present the case changed a lot, in the sense that the narrative aspect of the case, you can leave it off. And the redaction, the way you can find the main signifiers of the case is of the case you are, whose treatment you are taking care of, you can reduce the case to the main signifiers in the same way that you can, as doing or making the experience of the past, extract, you say, the alchemy, the alchemy of your, let's say, your personal symptom. In the same way, you are able to do this with your case when you go and supervise. You don't need more than 3 minutes to explain the supervisor why you are there.
That's the difference. Thank you, Susan. Gustavo, I'm so sorry we won't have time for everybody's questions, but that just makes us more hungry to do more work on this. I think it's, as you say, it's a crucial question for psychoanalysis, and why the silence around supervision. It's an interesting one. But I want to thank you so much, Gustavo, for your generosity in being with us here, and the provoking questions that you put forward in your presentation. It's wonderful.
My pleasure, and I would like to thank all of you.
Yes, and to thank Marlene, Sheila, Caroline, Linda, Susan, everyone for their questions and who has been with us here this evening. And to remind you that we have the privilege of hearing from you again in a clinical seminar. We're making you work this weekend, Gustavo, at a clinical seminar called Neither Angels Nor Demons, What Do Analysts Need to Know About Technology, which is a really on point topic right now. So I look forward to hearing from you then, and thank you all once again for being here with us this evening and transmitting such important aspects of the clinic and supervision. Thank you, Gustavo.
Thank you. Until tomorrow.
Until tomorrow. Thank you all. Bye.